The Memphis Belle came to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in 2005, but the restoration that's going right now was not the first restoration of the Memphis Belle. The Memphis Belle went through a restoration in the 1980s in Memphis, and during that time, all of the original markings, all the original paint, that was completely stripped off the aircraft. So when the National Museum got the Memphis Belle in 2005, all of the original markings had been long gone. So the National Museum had a choice, essentially. How are we going to paint this aircraft? So we basically had two choices. We could paint the aircraft as it was when it was in combat or shortly after it was in combat, or we could paint the aircraft as it appeared while it was on the war bond tour. And there were some very compelling reasons to pick one or the other markings package for the aircraft. And in the end, we decided to go with painting the aircraft as it was shortly after the 25th mission when it was still a combat aircraft. So the appearance of the Memphis Belle is often illustrated with a lot of extra markings on it, and we've come to call those markings publicity markings. So basically, about 3 weeks after the Memphis Belle finished its combat tour, it got in the hands of public affairs, and all these extra markings were added to the aircraft. Like there were mission names on the tail of the airplane, there was a row of swastikas underneath the row of bombs on the nose, the crew names were added, and then on top of this, there was countless graffiti. And the graffiti started while the airplane was over in England, and then when it went on the war bond tour, there was even more graffiti added. So all of these extra markings really don't represent the airplane as it was when it was a combat aircraft. During the combat tour and shortly after, the Memphis Belle didn't have nearly as many markings as it ended up having during the war bond tour. In fact, it didn't have the row of swastikas underneath the bombs, it didn't have a list of missions on the tail, it didn't have graffiti, and didn't have the crew names at the crew positions. So all of these markings really don't represent the artifact as it was during its most significant time. However, the iconic nose art, the word Memphis Belle, the row of bombs denoting the 25 missions, all of those markings were there. And there's another reason why we chose to mark the aircraft as it was shortly after the 25th mission, and that's because that is the time period that we have the best evidence to mark it correctly. We are incredibly fortunate that there are 11.5 hours of color footage of outtakes from the William Wyler 1944 movie, The Memphis Belle. The movie itself was only about 40 minutes long, but they actually shot 11.5 hours of footage. Now, remarkably, this original footage, these color outtakes, are preserved in the National Archives, and we obtained a digital copy of all of this film, and we've studied it carefully over many years. And what's very telling and very helpful is the visit from the King and the Queen on the 26th of May, 1943. So this is about a week and a half after the crew finished their 25th mission. And we've studied the footage of that, again, all in color and from different aspects of the aircraft. And it turns out that the markings that were evident during the King and Queen's visit on the 26th of May are identical to the markings of the aircraft about a day after it finished the 25th mission. So basically they just added the 25th bomb and it remained the same for that week and a half. So because accuracy is so important for us here at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, and really that is the most significant time period of the Memphis Belle. What's key to the story of the Memphis Belle is the 25 missions, that the crew finished 25 missions. And what's key is that it was a combat aircraft. So with all of those factors considered, that's why we chose to go with the markings of the airplane shortly after the 25th mission. Now, the publicity markings, as we call them, those are also very important to the story of the Memphis Belle. And so in the exhibit that's going to open on May 17th, 2018, 75 years to the day after the crew finished their 25th mission. In this exhibit, we will have some of that color footage that shows these publicity markings on the aircraft, and we'll also have an interpretation that kind of explains how these publicity markings were put on, what they were, and why those are important. So certainly it's an important part of the story, but we are going to represent the artifact itself as it was while it was still a combat aircraft. Many of us have looked at illustrations, paintings, prints of representing the Memphis Belle and how it appeared, but we've really come to understand that the Memphis Belle didn't really appear as we've seen it in illustrations. And again, going back to the outtakes, the William Wyler outtakes, they have been invaluable. We have a visual record of the Memphis Belle from January of 1943, only 2 months into the combat tour, all the way through and into the war bond tour in the summer of June 1943. So we have an excellent record of how the marking changed and what they look like. So what we've come to discover is that the petty illustration that the Memphis Belle nose art is based on is actually very different from the actual nose art on the aircraft. And it goes beyond the bathing suit on the left-hand side being blue and it being red on the right-hand side. It goes far beyond that. Turns out that the Memphis Belle on the left-hand side is a blonde, and on the right-hand side she's a brunette. And we've also come to discover by carefully studying this footage that her hair isn't the same kind of hairstyle as in the petty illustration. And then it's interesting how the left-hand side nose art actually differs in some details to the right side, the shape of the foot, shape of the shoe, and things like that. So it's been really interesting to see how the nose art actually appeared, and that has been replicated perfectly on the Memphis Belle itself now. There are also some other interesting markings that are on the Memphis Belle. The row of bombs is very uneven, rather crudely painted. The stars that are above the bombs are not perfectly symmetrical. Neither are the swastikas noting the kills of German fighters. So all of these rough markings are being replicated exactly as they were on the Memphis Belle. So if it was done crudely in 1943, it was replicated crudely in 2018. Getting the colors right on the Memphis Belle was a huge challenge. The basic coloring is olive drab, and olive drab is a particularly challenging color because it has so many pigments in it, and it shifts away from the desired shade very easily. And on top of it, the Memphis Belle had different shades of olive drab on different parts of the aircraft. So the overall olive drab is on the top of the airplane, but the vertical tail actually is a different shade of olive drab due to two things. One, that subassembly was painted in a different place at Boeing, and there's just variances in the way that when the paint's mixed. But also, too, the tail that's on the Memphis Belle is not the tail that the Memphis Belle came to England with. They took tremendous damage on one mission, and a huge hole was blown in the vertical tail, so it was actually replaced. So there's a color difference there. It's visible in the outtakes, it's evident. And then also the control surfaces are a surprisingly different shade of olive drab. They faded at a different rate, but they were also a different color when they were painted on originally. So we worked very, very hard to replicate these shades of olive drab. And here's an example of the length that the staff here went to get this right. The control surface color was probably the most difficult. And there ended up being more than 25 different mixes made, 25 different samples mixed to get that color just right. And what we ended up deciding, it's a shade that has 9 different pigments in it to get to that shade. But it's very, very satisfying to see the airplane replicating what we're seeing in this original footage from 1943 in the William Wyler outtakes. And then there's another interesting part of the markings. There was a camouflage that existed only really for a short period of time in 1942 and early 1943, where there was olive drab on the aircraft, and then there was a more forest green, which was called medium green, splotches that were put across the aircraft. Now, each B-17 had its own unique pattern of these medium green splotches, and our restoration staff have replicated this camouflage pattern right down to, in some places, the paint where the medium green was applied is kind of thin and it looks kind of sloppy. Well, they've replicated that as well, and we have such great evidence in these William Wyler outtakes. Another challenge with the olive drab is the particular color of olive drab. It's known as dark olive drab 41, and that's how the Memphis Belle was painted when it left the factory. The problem with dark olive drab 41 is that it broke down quickly in sunlight, and it broke down in different ways. It had purples, it had browns, it was different from airplane to airplane. Well, the Memphis Belle rolled out of the factory in the summer of '42 and finished its 25th mission in May of 1943, and had essentially been sitting outside exposed to sunlight for months and months and months. Now, normally at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, we paint the airplanes in what we call factory fresh markings. So we had to make a decision. Do we go with factory fresh markings, which really wouldn't be accurate? Or do we go with the faded olive drab as the Memphis Belle appeared in the summer of 1943? Well, in the end, we decided to make it in the faded appearance for accuracy's sake. But it was a kind of a new experience for us to study and try to understand what did that look like, because even though we had these color outtakes, which are fantastic, depending on the exposure, sunlight, different shots, we see different colors. So we had to make some value judgments about exactly what is that shade. And like one problem, to get the exposure right for the film, they had to use bright lights. So in some cases, they're shining bright lights on the airplane, which changes the color of the airplane. Some of the shots were in the evening, some of them were in the morning. So you can see the problem where we're trying to understand, okay, exactly what shade is this? But in the end, we are all very confident we replicated that shade accurately. What's pretty amazing about the outtakes from William Wyler and his cameramen, what's really amazing is that I can't think of any other restoration that has been done at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force that has so much visual evidence. And at the same time, I can't think of any other plane that if we had the choice to have this wealth of information, I can't think of any other plane that we would want to pick that for. So it was a perfect marriage. It was serendipity, but I'd like to point out that William Wyler's work came at a great cost. One of his cameramen was killed on a combat mission. So without William Wyler and his cameramen risking their lives to go on these combat missions, we certainly couldn't have restored the Memphis Belle to the accuracy that we are restoring it to, but also too, we wouldn't have this incredible visual record of the operations of heavy bombers and heavy bomber crewmen in 1942 and 1943. It's truly amazing. So there are some really interesting, if you will, inconsistencies in the way that the Memphis Belle will be marked. And one example of those is that there are stencils on only 3 of the 4 props. The number 1 engine, for whatever reason, did not have the standard stenciling on it. It's evident in the photos, it's evident in the William Wyler outtakes. So we have replicated that as it was around the time of the 25th mission. So when you come and visit, see if you can find any of those inconsistencies.